The day my daughter stood at the altar as her mother's maid of honor, smiling at the man who had taken my place, was the day I finally understood what I had built my entire life for. And it wasn't the house. It wasn't the savings account. It wasn't even the 32 years I spent pouring concrete in Texas heat so my family could have something solid under their feet. It was the lesson, the one I never had to teach, because life taught it for me. I'll start at the beginning, though, because none of this makes sense without it. My name is Frank. No, wait. My name is not important. What's important is that I'm 63 years old, I drink my coffee black, I drive a 2009 Ford F-150 that I refuse to trade in, and I have spent the better part of 4 decades building things: roads, foundations, retaining walls, drainage systems in suburbs where people never think about where the water goes until it's in their basement. I was a civil engineer by training and a contractor by choice. There's a difference. Engineers draw plans, contractors show up when it rains. My wife, my ex-wife, her name was Miriam. We met when I was 26, at a church potluck in Abilene, Texas. She was pretty and sharp-tongued, and she laughed at things most people didn't find funny. I loved that about her. We got married 8 months later. Our daughter Stella was born 2 years after that, and then our son Owen came along 4 years behind her. For the first 15 years, things were fine. Not romantic movie fine, but real life fine. We argued about money sometimes. She wanted a bigger house in a nicer neighborhood. I wanted to pay off the mortgage on the one we had. She thought I was cheap. I thought she didn't understand compound interest. We went back and forth like that. It wasn't ugly. It was just the low hum of 2 people wanting different things and negotiating the distance. Then I landed the Ridgemont contract. Ridgemont was a commercial development outside of Fort Worth. 3 phases, $4.2 million. The biggest thing I'd ever bid on. I put everything into it. I mean everything. 12-hour days, 7-day weeks. Sometimes I'd sleep in my truck at the site, rather than drive 40 minutes home, just to turn around and drive 40 minutes back. Miriam said she understood. She said she was proud of me. But there's a version of understanding that's really just waiting, and I think that's what she was doing. Waiting for the project to end. Waiting for me to come back. And when I finally did, when Ridgemont was done and we had more money than we'd ever had, she looked at me like she didn't recognize who walked in the door. I was 51. I had reading glasses and a bad knee and calluses on my hands that never fully softened. I wasn't the 26-year-old she married. Neither was she. I thought that was normal. I thought that was what 51 looked like. That's when Miriam started mentioning his name. His name was Clifford Bain. He went by Cliff. He had moved into the neighborhood 2 years earlier, one of the new builds on the east end of the development I helped grade, which has always struck me as deeply ironic. He was a financial advisor, dressed well, drove a black Mercedes that he got detailed once a week. He was 10 years younger than me, and he had all his hair, and he used words like curated and synergy in casual conversation, and somehow that impressed people. Miriam started having coffee with him. Book club, she said, even though I'd never known her to read. Then it was neighborhood association meetings. Then it was just, he was around, at our house, sitting at my kitchen table drinking the coffee I bought. I asked her once, directly, I said, "Miriam, is something happening with Cliff?" She looked at me the way you look at someone who's just embarrassed themselves in public. Patient, a little sad. "He's a friend," she said. "Something you've never been good at making." I didn't say anything else. I went to the garage and I sat with my tools and I tried to figure out when I had become the kind of man who got pitied in his own house. 6 months later, she told me she wanted a divorce. The kids were grown by then. Stella was 24, out of college, working in marketing in Austin. Owen was 20, finishing up his 2nd year at Texas Tech. Miriam told them both before she told me, which I only found out later. She'd been building a case, presenting evidence, getting them on board before I even knew there was a vote. The settlement was, look, I'm not going to lie and say I was blindsided. I knew what I'd built. I knew what the assets were. But knowing doesn't make it easier when you're sitting across from a mediator, watching a spreadsheet of your entire adult life get divided in 2. She got the house. We'd paid it off the year before. I had insisted on that, which she'd fought me on, which she was now extremely glad about. She got half the retirement accounts. She got the truck she drove, which I had bought. I got my work truck, my tools, my business, and a checking account that felt suddenly very small. I moved into a rental in Weatherford. 2 bedrooms, beige carpet, a kitchen window that looked out at a parking lot. I set up a folding table for my drafting work, and I kept going. What else do you do? I kept going. Within 4 months, Miriam and Cliff were engaged. Owen called to tell me. He said it casually, the way you mention weather. Mum and Cliff are getting married in the spring. I think it's going to be a small thing. You know, at the botanical garden. I said, okay. He said, she wanted you to hear it from family. I said, okay. There was a pause. Then he said, Dad, Cliff's a good guy. He's been really good to her. And you have to admit he's done well for himself. I let that sit for a moment. Yeah, I said. I've seen the car. Owen laughed, but it wasn't quite a real laugh. There was something underneath it, something that sounded like an apology for something he hadn't said yet. He said it 3 weeks later. Cliff had asked him to be a groomsman. He'd said yes. And then, this is the part that I had to sit with for a long time, Cliff had asked him to give a toast at the rehearsal dinner. About what a great man Cliff was, about how he'd brought joy back to the family. Owen said, I hope you understand, Dad. He's been there, you know. Present. It means a lot to Mom. Present. That word. As if 32 years of waking up before dawn so your son could have new cleats every season didn't count as presents, as if the Ridgemont contract was a vacation I'd taken for myself. I said, I understand, Owen. I didn't say anything else. But I heard what he was really saying. He was saying you were gone too much, you were working too much, you were building the wrong things. And maybe some part of that was true. I've turned it over enough times to admit that. But there's another truth sitting right next to it. I was working that hard for them. Not for me. I didn't need a Mercedes. I didn't need a curated financial portfolio. I needed my family to be okay. Stella called the day after Owen did. I could tell she'd rehearsed what she was going to say. She was careful with her words in a way she usually wasn't. She said, Dad, I'm going to be Mom's maid of honor. I want you to know that doesn't mean I'm taking sides. I said, it's all right, honey. She said, it's just, she's my mother and she's happy. I can see she's happy. I said, I know. And I did know. That was the complicated part. I wasn't angry at Miriam for being happy. I was sad that her happiness didn't involve me anymore. Those are different things. People confuse them. What I didn't tell Stella, what I didn't tell anyone, was that 2 weeks earlier I had accepted a contract offer from a development group in Bozeman, Montana. Commercial and residential infrastructure work, a 2-year initial commitment with options to extend. Good money. Better than good, and I had already signed the papers. I didn't leave because of the wedding. I want to be clear about that. I had been thinking about leaving Texas for a long time. The heat was getting to my knees. The market had shifted. And honestly, a man can only look at a parking lot for so long before he needs to see mountains. But I won't pretend the timing wasn't also a relief. I packed what fit in my truck, which wasn't much, because I've never owned a lot of things I didn't use, and I drove north in March. 32 hours over 3 days. I stopped in Amarillo the first night, in Denver the second. When I came down out of the pass into the Gallatin Valley and saw the Bridger Range sitting there under a foot of late-season snow, I pulled over on the shoulder and I just sat for a minute. Not crying, not quite, just sitting. I called Owen when I got to Bozeman. I left him a voicemail. I told him where I was and that I'd send my new address when I had one. He texted back 2 hours later, Okay, good luck, Dad. That was it. That was the whole message. The wedding was in April. I know because Stella sent me a photo the next morning. She looked beautiful. Miriam looked happy. Cliff looked. Honestly, he looked like a man who had gotten everything he wanted. Pressed suit. Big smile. Both hands on Miriam's waist in a way that I recognized and tried not to think about. Owen was in the background of one of the photos, laughing at something. He looked like he belonged there. I put my phone down and I went to work. Bozeman is different from Texas in ways that are obvious and ways that are not. The obvious ones, cold, mountains, no humidity, people nod at you on trails. The less obvious ones, the pace. People up there don't seem to be in a race with each other. A contractor friend of mine once told me Montanans have a saying. Something like, "We don't care how you did it back where you came from." I liked that. I needed that. The work was solid. The development group, a company called Rimrock Partners, knew what they were doing. I managed 3 crews over my first year and brought 2 phases in ahead of schedule. By the end of year 1, they offered me a partnership stake. Not a salary bump. A stake. I had to think about it for a week before I said yes, but I said yes. I bought a small house just outside of town. 3 bedrooms, a detached garage I turned into a real workshop, and a covered porch that faces west. The sunsets there do something to you. I'm not a man who talks about sunsets usually, but I'm telling you, they do something. I also bought a whole hog smoker and a decent collection of firewood, and I started making friends the old-fashioned way, which is by cooking for people and not talking too much. Back in Texas, Miriam and Cliff were building their life. I knew the broad strokes because Stella kept in touch. Not regularly, but enough. She was good that way. She'd check in every couple of weeks. A phone call, maybe 20 minutes. She asked about Montana, about the job, about whether I'd met anyone. I hadn't. I told her that. She sighed in a way that wasn't quite pity. Owen and I were more distant. He graduated from Texas Tech the spring after the wedding. I sent him a check and a card. He sent back a 1-line text. "Thanks, Dad. I called on his birthday." He answered. We talked for maybe 8 minutes. He told me he'd gotten a job in Dallas doing sales for a software company. He said Cliff had made the introduction. Of course he had. What I didn't know then, what I was only putting together later, in pieces, was what was happening behind the scenes with Cliff's finances. Because that's the thing about a man who is very good at seeming financially sophisticated. It can take a while before the gap between appearance and reality becomes visible. Cliff's firm, which he ran out of an office in Southlake, managed investment portfolios for about 80 clients. Most of them were small business owners, retirees, people who had worked hard their whole lives and trusted someone who wore a good suit to handle what they'd saved. What Cliff was actually doing with some of those funds, particularly the discretionary accounts where he had direct trading authority, was a thing that would eventually generate a 47-page SEC complaint and a federal indictment. I'm not going to pretend I understood all of it, but the short version is, he was moving client money into investments he had an undisclosed financial interest in, collecting fees on both ends, and reporting returns that were partially fabricated. Classic stuff, apparently. Old as the industry. The complaint was filed on a Thursday in November, about 19 months after the wedding. By Friday morning, his firm's accounts were frozen. By Friday afternoon, his name was on the local news. By Saturday, the Mercedes was gone. I assume repossessed or seized, I'm not sure which, and Miriam was calling Owen asking what to do. I found out about all of this in stages. First Stella called, very quiet, and told me there was a situation. Then Owen called, which surprised me. It was the most proactive he'd been in 2 years, and said that things were bad. Really bad. The house they'd bought together had a second mortgage Miriam hadn't known about. Cliff had taken a significant amount of equity out of it during the period he was trying to cover his losses, and he'd done it in a way that, through some legal mechanism I still don't fully follow, meant the lender had grounds to accelerate the loan. Miriam called me on a Tuesday night. I was on the porch, and the temperature had dropped into the 20s, and I had a fire going in the fire pit, and I was just sitting with it. She said, "Frank." That's my actual name, Frank. She never called me that when we were married. She called me Franco, which was a thing she'd done since our first year together that I always pretended to find annoying. She said, "Frank, I need to talk to you." I said, "All right." She said the house might be gone. She said she didn't have access to liquid assets because most of what she had was tied up in Cliff's business accounts, which were frozen. She said she was scared. I listened. I let her say all of it. Then she said, "I know I have no right to ask this." I said, "No." She said, "I haven't even asked yet." I said, "I know what you're going to ask." There was a long silence. I said, "Miriam, I'm not going to lend you money. I'm not going to co-sign anything. I'm not going to be the solution to a problem that you have to work through with your husband and his attorneys." She started to say something. I said, "I'm not angry. I want you to hear me say that. I'm not bitter, but I spent 32 years building something, and I walked away from half of it because that was the right thing to do. What I kept is mine. It stays mine." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You've gotten harder." I thought about that. I said, "I think I've gotten clearer." We hung up shortly after. I sat by the fire for another hour. What happened next with Cliff was a long, ugly, grinding legal process that I mostly followed at a distance through court documents that became public record. He pled guilty to 1 count of securities fraud and 2 counts of wire fraud. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of approximately $2.1 million to his former clients. The house was sold in a short sale. Miriam came out of it with essentially nothing except what she'd had going into the marriage, which was the half of my retirement account she'd gotten in the settlement, and which she had, apparently, given Cliff authority to manage. He'd lost a significant portion of it. I didn't say anything when Stella told me that. What do you say? Miriam moved into a small apartment in Arlington. She got a job as an office manager for a pediatric dentist's practice. She was 61 years old and starting over in a way she had not planned for. I want to be honest here. I felt sorry for her. Not triumphant, not satisfied. Just sorry. The way you feel sorry for someone who walked off a cliff they could see from where you were standing. The sadness has nothing to do with whether they deserved it. Owen was the one who surprised me. He showed up in Bozeman on a Friday in March. Didn't call ahead. I heard the knock at the door at about 7 in the evening, and I opened it, and there he was. He looked tired. He'd driven from Dallas in 2 days, which is the kind of thing a 24-year-old does when he doesn't know how to make a phone call about something hard. I stepped back and let him in. I put on the coffee. He sat at my kitchen table, a real table now, not a folding one, and he looked around the house for a while without saying anything. Then he said, "This is a good place." I said, "It suits me." He said, "I heard you have a partnership." I said, "Yeah." He looked down at his hands. They looked like my hands when I was his age. I hadn't noticed that before. He said, "Dad, I said some things. Or, I didn't say things, but I felt things, and you knew I felt them. About you working too much. About Cliff being." He stopped. I thought he was what a successful man was supposed to look like. I was 20 years old. I thought the car and the office and the way he talked meant something real. I poured the coffee and put a mug in front of him. He said I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I sat across from him. The fire was going in the wood stove in the corner. Outside, you could see the lights of town down the valley. I said, "Owen, you were a kid." He said, "I was old enough." I said, "Maybe. But being old enough to know better doesn't always mean you do. I made plenty of mistakes at 20 that I'd do differently now." He looked up. I said, "What I need you to understand, not for me, but for yourself, is the difference between the appearance of success and the actual thing." Cliff looked successful. He had the vocabulary and the suit and the right car for the right neighborhood. But he was hollow underneath it. A man who's genuinely built something doesn't need to convince you of it. It just is. Owen was quiet. I said, "Every concrete footing I ever poured, I poured it right. Even when nobody was watching. Even when it would have been easy to cut a corner. Because the building goes on top of it, and people go inside the building, and they trust that the thing underneath them is solid. That's the job. That's all it ever was." He nodded slowly. I said, "You have time to build something real. You're 24. That's nothing. That's the beginning." He stayed for 5 days. I put him in the second bedroom. We worked on the workshop together. I was building some shelving, and we drove up to the mountains one afternoon and walked around in the snow like a couple of idiots who didn't pack the right boots. We ate a lot of smoked brisket because I had made too much. He slept until 9 every morning, and I let him, because I could tell he hadn't slept properly in a while. The day before he left, he asked if he could come back in the summer. I said yes. I said it before he finished the sentence. What happened after that unfolded slowly, the way good things usually do. Owen ended up leaving the Dallas job, which he said had never been right for him, and taking a position with an engineering firm in Helena. He'd always been good at math, better than he knew. He and I started talking on the phone every week or so, real conversations, not 8-minute exchanges, the kind where you lose track of time. Stella came to visit in July with her boyfriend, a quiet man named, well, I liked him. That's the important thing. He fixed the screen door that I'd been meaning to get to for 3 months, and then helped me smoke a whole brisket and ate 4 servings without being asked twice. That's the kind of man you keep. Miriam and I have spoken a handful of times since that Tuesday night phone call. Civilly, she seems to be finding her footing. I hope she does, I mean that. My partnership stake in Rimrock Partners became, over the following 2 years, something substantial. We expanded into a third development area and brought in a national infrastructure contract that I managed for 14 months. I'm not going to quote you numbers because that's not the point. The point is that I kept doing the work the right way, and the work kept being worth doing. And somewhere in the process, I stopped keeping track of what I'd lost and started keeping track of what I'd built. There's a ridge behind my house. You have to hike about 40 minutes to get to the top, and in the summer, the wildflowers up there are the kind of thing that makes you understand why people paint. I go up there when I need to think. Sometimes I take Owen when he's in town. Sometimes I go alone. Last September, I was up there by myself on a Tuesday morning, which is the kind of thing you can do when you own part of the company and nobody questions your schedule. I was sitting on a flat rock looking out at the valley, and I was thinking about the day I left Texas, about the Ridgemont contract, about the night Miriam told me she wanted a divorce, about Owen's voicemail response, about the parking lot outside the Weatherford rental. And I thought, none of that broke me. Every single one of those things felt, at the time, like it was going to break me, and not one of them did. I don't think I'm special. I don't think I figured out something other people haven't figured out. I think I just kept showing up to work, and I kept pouring the footings right even nobody was watching, when nobody was watching, and eventually the building went up. That's the thing about foundations. You can't see them once the work is done, but everything stands on them. I came down off the ridge in time for a 2 o'clock site meeting and a phone call with Owen at 5 and a dinner I was making for myself. Smoked chicken, roasted potatoes, a beer on the porch after, and I thought, this is what I built. This quiet, this solid ground. It was enough. It was more than enough. It turned out to be exactly the right thing.